thanks for coming here. So this is going to be kind of my take on that passage in Matthew. And what I'm going to try to do is give, at least as best I can, context the way I view it, as it would be to the writer of that passage or somebody who would read that passage during that period of time, and then try to put it in a broader context and also have a personal story that explains why I'm interested in this topic to begin with. So is that okay with people? You can interrupt with questions. I don't know how better to steer the conversation than to just start talking, and I'm talking about too much about one thing. Just raise your hand and say, okay, I've heard enough of that. Go on to something else. Okay, or I'd like to hear more about this. So let's give that a shot. So the first comment that I have, which is interesting about a lot of cultures, is some cultures will take another culture's traditions that are poorly understood or not completely understood, and then transfer them as if to sort of transfer the magic of that other culture. So I'll give you an example that has nothing to do with this passage in Matthew. When the Saxons came to England, they saw artifacts like Stonehenge and Avebury and these strange burial mounds where the people who built Stonehenge and Avebury buried their people, but they didn't know anything about that culture. In fact, they know very little about the culture except what's left behind. And what they started to do was to imitate the burial practices of the people who built Avebury and Stonehenge, perhaps to try to rekindle the magic that they had somehow. This burial practice had some possessive magic associated with it. And also in Saxon culture, you can see something very similar in the story of Beowulf. Now, I don't know how many of you have read Beowulf, but let me just give away the ending, okay? So in the end, Beowulf is king of the Geats, and there is this destitute man who raids the tomb of a long-dead civilization, the tomb of the last man of a long-dead civilization, of whom nobody knows anything about the civilization, much like the Saxons arrived in England. And when he steals the treasures out of the tomb, it awakens the wrath of the dragon that's there guarding the tomb. So Beowulf goes into combat, slays the dragon, but is mortally wounded in the process. And then his people bury him in a burial mound, which basically imitates the burial mound that was raised by the destitute man. And that's the ending of Beowulf. So both in the physical Saxon practice and in the story of Beowulf, you see where they're borrowing the traditions of the culture of the people who built, say, Stonehenge and that sort of thing, and translate it over into their own culture. So, in a sense, what I'm going to try to do is walk you down a similar path, but explain some of the issues that we would associate with astronomy and astrology, and how that penetrates the story of Matthew. So, there are two traditions that emerge, which both are curiously Northern European and relate to Stonehenge, and Semitic. And when I say Semitic, that relates to the Semitic language families. We're talking about Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, and all the other language families. And you can go back and just look at the language itself and already see that there is a veneration for the direction east that we see so prominently in Matthew. And in Indo-European languages, the word for east is synonymous with rising, like the rising of the sun. And the prominence or the preeminence of the direction east can be seen also in the fact that the word for north is derived from the word for left. So as you're facing east, north is to your left. Okay. So you see this both in Semitic cultures in the Middle East and also in Northern European cultures, even though they have different language roots that are driving them. So there's something very fundamental about the relationship of people with their environment that gives a primacy to the east. You might ask why. Well, just put yourselves in the shoes of a traveler back in 4000 BC. So you travel during the day, and then you have an encampment at night, and then when you wake up in the morning, you orient yourself with the sun rising. So in fact, in Latin, the word for east is oriens, which is the root for orient and orientation, so it does this double duty. And in fact, in Matthew, you see this rising in the east and the wise men from the east and these things. And in Greek, the word is Anatolan, and Anatolan both means rising and east. And so you have these double duty translations into English in Matthew as well. So there is this primacy of the direction east already that appears in the language that predates any artifacts that we can see. You can see it in about 2600 BC with Stonehenge, which has this arrangement, a circular arrangement. And from the center of Stonehenge, there is a heel stone that projects out to the northeast. And if you look at that alignment, that corresponds exactly to the direction of the rising sun at the summer solstice. And other varieties like Avebury, which is a stone circle, and other stone monuments have astronomical alignments that basically point to the rising of the sun, typically in the summer or the winter solstice. And so there's already this linkage between the east, the direction east, and astronomical alignments in the culture. This is also true in Semitic traditions. One of the earliest maps that shows any kind of orientation. If we look at a map today, you'll see north at the top and east at the right and west at the left. Well, that's kind of an arbitrary decision. In Semitic traditions, maps typically had east at the north. Oh, east at the top. Sorry. East at the top. So there was the very first map that was found that we know of that has an orientation is in Mesopotamia in an old town called Nuzi. And this is basically a map of a field and some mountains and a river, and east is at the top of that map. Also in Northern European traditions, there's a kind of map called a TO map. And what a TO map looks like, it's a representation of the known world, and it looks something like this. I'll just draw the crudest approximation for it. Okay, so this is a TO map. The concept is that there's an encircling ocean around the known parts of the world. This is the Mediterranean here. Okay, this is Europe. This is Africa. This is Asia. And this is the Don River, and this is the Nile here. And right at the center is Jerusalem. And Eden is frequently portrayed as being at the top of the map. A lot of times if you see this map, also Jesus is shown at the tops of these maps and representations in Northern Europe. So there's this primacy of East in the orientation of maps. Also in the construction of churches in Northern Europe, from the Saxon era onward, you see this orientation towards the east. I love the fact that I'm using the word orientation and east in the same sentence. In fact, the structure of our church is quite similar to this. So you have the aisle, and it culminates in the altar, and the altar is in the east. And burial grounds would be near the church, would have people buried so that their feet would be pointing towards the east. So there's this veneration of the east in Northern Europe. Another aspect is where the word Easter comes from. Easter is borrowed from the northern German so-called pagan tradition of a goddess who would arise at the vernal equinox, due east as well. So that's actually where the word Easter comes from. It's borrowed from the northern European term. There are also many temples that were discovered that have an orientation towards the east in Semitic language-speaking traditions, and I'll talk about that in a minute. If you go to the Old Testament, in Numbers, there is this passage about the tabernacle of Moses, and I'll just repeat the passage in English. Those who were to camp before the tabernacle on the east, before the tent of the meeting, toward the sunrise, were Moses and Aaron and his sons, guarding the sanctuary itself to protect the people of Israel, and any outsider who came near was to be put to death. So the tabernacle of Moses on Mount Sinai was facing east, and you could see the explicit coupling of the sunrise with the east in this case. So that kind of sets the stage already for the veneration of things in the east. So now let me talk a little bit about astrology, because this is going to come into play in the story of the Magi. But before I do, there's a few concepts that you should probably know about, which tie into the story of the star. So in Egypt, priests were trying to use the stars as a predictor of various events. And one of the issues is, where is the sun with respect to the stars in the sky? Now, I'll just tell you an astronomical fact, and that is because of the Earth's orbit around the sun will have a different position with respect to the stars in the sky over the course of the year. So if you look at the stars in the sky just after sunset, you'll see the slow progression from the east to the west. So for example, in October, just after sunset, you'll see the Pleiades rising in the east, and that's a harbinger of the winter to come. So I'm not the only person. Polynesians use the arrival of the Pleiades just after sunset as a harbinger of the stormy season. And likewise, Antares, which is in Scorpio, when it appears just after sunset, is a harbinger of the summer, the warm season. So this appearance of stars just after sunset already gives you a way of looking at the seasons. Now there's another issue, which is the precision with which you can determine the position of the sun in the sky, because when you see the sun, of course, you can't see stars, it just obliterates stars. So how can you track the passage of the sun with respect to the background of the stars? So the Egyptian priests had a rather curious system, which was something like the following. It was called looking at a heliacal rising. And that is the star that rises just before sunrise. So you can imagine looking towards the east, and a star appears, a bright star, and you can then look at the position of the star with respect to the sun just before it rises. You can look at the horizon, put a little, rock on the ground where you see the star, and then when the sun rises, you can put a rock on the ground where you see the sun rising. And over the course of a year, you can track the position of the sun with respect to the fixed stars. Okay? And you can also do timing between the time it takes for the star to rise and the sun to rise to the same height. So that way you can map out the position of the sun against the fixed background of stars. And this already has some predictive power. So for example, the appearance of Sirius just before sunrise, the heliacal rising of Sirius was a harbinger of the flood of the Nile. So you would have a period where Sirius would appear just above the sun after sunset, and then at a certain point it would be obliterated because it would be too close to the sun, and then you would start to see it rising in the east just before the sunrise, and that would be a sign that the Nile was about to flood. So it has some predictive power. Other predictive powers of things in the sky is the moon and tides, and so the moon has some influence on tides on Earth. So you can see that the passage of the seasons and the time of the passage of seasons to celestial events is real. I mean, it's not that the appearance of Sirius causes the Nile to flood, but it's the timing. So you can imagine then that the idea of extending this to human affairs and human events would be rather natural. And so this is sort of the birth of astrology, if you like. So let me tell you a little bit about astrology and two pieces of astrology that are important. There's a kind of astrology that you read in the newspaper, and that's a very small subset of the way it works. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with natal astrology, but the idea of natal astrology is that if you know the time, date, and location of somebody's birth, and the positions of stars in the sky, especially the zodiac, which is the path the sun takes its passage through the zodiacal signs like Libra, Pisces, Sagittarius, and so on. If you know the alignment of the zodiacal signs with respect to positions in the sky and the major planets and the sun and the moon, then you can predict with a natal horoscope, a birth horoscope, the events in a person's life. So let me explain a little bit about the system if I can. So probably you've heard The Age of Aquarius, that song, right? When the moon is in the seventh house. So this actually has some meaning in terms of astrology. So first, the idea is that all the planets and the sun are moving in the same plane, the plane of the ecliptic. And that's mainly because the solar system has a common origin, or a sort of proto-disk that formed all the planets, and so all the orbits basically lie in the same plane. So that when we see the planets, they're all going to be more or less clustered around this plane that the sun is taking, or actually the Earth's orbit is taking, if you want to take the viewpoint of the sun being the center of the solar system, which it is, but You can also put together a system that works perfectly well with the Earth being the center, and it's not until you make some careful observations that you can actually see that creates an issue. So the sun and all the planets will appear in these zodiacal signs and move around. And so you could assign, or the Babylonians made a division of the ecliptic into 12 different zones, and these each had a different kind of meaning. So Leo, the lion, has a certain kind of personality that you might associate with it. Pisces has another kind of personality, and these are the so-called sun signs. And so you could just look at the positions of the stars, at the planets with respect to the zodiacal signs at the time of a person's birth and make some sort of a horoscope prediction. But that's not all. So this gets back to the house system. So the idea of the house system is that at the moment of the person's birth, in a given location, there are a set of houses that divide the sky into 12 pieces. And so I'll try to just sketch it for you here. So this is up, which is the very top, is called midheaven. And the bottom is called the nadir, so that's underneath us. And then there's the eastern horizon, and then there's the western horizon. So this is at the moment of the person's birth. And so there's a division, let me get this right now, so it's always tough to divide something into 12. So I guess if I do this, it's sort of like cutting a pizza. So the first house is just below the eastern horizon, and that's the birth house. And then you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the division between the 6th and the 7th houses on the western horizon, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And at that moment, you have some alignment of the stars, of the constellations of the zodiac with respect to these houses. And you have an alignment of planets. Now, each one of these houses has a specific meaning. So this, for example, is the spouse house. So some alignment within the 7th house has a meaning for your relationship with your spouse. This is the religion house, and this is called the kingdom, the 10th house, which could be your vocation, or it could also be a sense of power associated with it. So just to give you an example which has nothing to do with Matthew, let's say you had Mars in your spouse house when you were born. That would be a good sign because Mars is the god of war, and that would imply that good relations with your spouse. On the other hand, if you had Venus in your spouse house when you were born, that would be a good thing because Venus is the goddess of love, and so presumably that would augur well. So you can see already how the alignments of stars at the moment of birth would have some implications for a person's life. So the idea then is you just interpose the planets, the sun, the moon, and the zodiac, and you're able to predict the outcome of somebody's life. So that's the natal horoscope. There are also a kind of political horoscope, if you like, which have to do with alignments of planets, conjunctions of planets, calliope risings. And so these are things that are not specifically tied to the date and the position of somebody's birth, but it's just something that is sort of coincidences that are happening up in the sky as used as a prediction of some kind. And I should mention something interesting. I found a table of latitudes and longitudes from the Middle Ages that was both Arabic and Latin, and I deciphered it. And one of the interesting issues is what do people use tables of latitudes and longitudes for in the Middle Ages? Okay, your first guess might be navigation, but you're wrong. It's doing natal horoscopes, because in order to do somebody's horoscope, you have to know the latitude and longitude of their birth position as well as the date and time of their birth to do a proper natal horoscope. And so you take that and then you take a table called an ephemeris that tells you the locations of the stars, and then you're able to throw a horoscope for somebody. So that's the background of how astrology works. So let's go back to the historical context now. Astrology was developed by the Babylonians, and the Greeks carried it on, and also the Persians. And one particular religion in 600 BC is Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was basically an astrological religion. They had these sort of house systems, and they also predicted political events and political risings and conjunctions and that kind of thing. And the word Zoroaster, who is the embodiment of the religion, the Zo means living, and Aster is a word that means star. So it's like the incarnation of the living star, if you like. And the priests who did all the calculations for the horoscopes in Zoroastrianism were called Magi. And this is where the word Magi comes from, is from the Zoroastrian priests. And then this penetrated into Greek, and so in Greek, anybody who could do these kind of religious or astrological calculations were referred to as Magi, and this is also the root of the word for magic and magical. And so they're all connected in a fairly well understood way. So that was 600 BC. Now, to move forward to the story of Matthew, there's also an interesting recent archaeological find which sheds a little bit of additional light, I suppose, into this passage in Matthew. So, how many of you have heard of the Nabateans? Anybody? Nobody's heard of the Nabateans. Okay, so I can tell you something then. So, just to the east of the Jordan River, there was a group of people called the Nabateans, and there's a famous remains of a beautiful town called Petra in southern Jordan, which has these beautiful stone carvings, and this was built by the Nabateans. They're a group of people that, in effect, were kind of like itinerant traders who would travel from the Red Sea up to the Persian Gulf, through the Syrian desert, west to Judea, Samaria, Judah, Israel, and basically sort of like Berbers or Tuaregs were traders who travel around and make their living that way. And they were contemporaneous with Herod and the writer of Matthew. And they also practiced a kind of astrology. And there was a recent finding in a place called Kirbet Etonur, which is just east of the Jordan River on a hilltop. And it is a temple that was used by the Nabateans, and it faces east, so it has the same configuration that we would see in Northern European churches, for example, with an altar culminating in the east and an aisle, a nave that was pointing from west to east. And at the entrance of it was carving of the zodiac. So these Nabateans were basically zodiacal or astrological in nature in the way they interpreted events. Now, I've read, and I believe this is probably well substantiated by a couple of sources, is that Herod's mother was a Nabatean, and Herod actually did battle with the Nabateans. And so we're talking about two groups of people that were kind of sharing or pushing up against each other in that era. Okay, so that kind of sets the stage for what is to then come. So if you look then at the story of the Magi, they come from the east. We don't know, exactly who they were, but you might imagine, or at least what somebody reading the passage would imagine, they would be Nabatean priests who practiced astrology in some way. And they had something like a heliacal rising of a star and an astrological or astronomical configuration that presaged something that was significant, a political event, in the way that you could use astrology to presage political events in some way. And if you want to ask about the age of Aquarius later on, I can explain what the age of Aquarius means and what the age of Pisces means and that sort of stuff. So anyway, the way the story unfolds is there is this rising of a star in the east. And so I would associate that with a heliacal rising. Now, the time it would take for a star to proceed from a heliacal rising in the east to, at the sunrise, being directly overhead or in the midheaven would be about 90 days. So you could imagine that this would be roughly consistent in somebody's mind of a trek from the Syrian desert westward to Jerusalem. So this is not the idea that these guys, the star rises, it rises at, a certain time in the evening, let's say it rises at 6 p.m., it's overhead at 9 p.m. nobody can travel that quickly. But if you interpret it as the passage with respect to heliacal risings, then the time scale makes a lot more sense from that viewpoint. So what I imagine the story is intended to convey is that the Magi, from astronomical alignments, believed that there was some portentous happening that was about to occur. And the idea is that if you take this process and you predict the time and date of birth, then you could look at the astrological alignments and kind of reverse engineer it, sort of pick a point where the person was born and the time when the person was born. So my interpretation is that one is supposed to infer that the Magi determined the date and the time of the birth of Jesus, and then went seeking that in some sort of a kind of a successive approximations until they got exactly to that point. So when the Magi arrive in the vicinity of Herod, the fact that Herod would have some credence or associate some credence with astrology, presumably because of the Nabateans, this is also kind of validating the viewpoint of the Magi, which is why he says, go and find the child. And so now the other issue which is interesting about the passage is there is this quote also from Numbers, which is forecasting that the king of the Jews would be born in Bethlehem, which is interesting because I think this is the only one of the Gospels where Bethlehem actually appears to be associated with Jesus, because other places it's Nazareth and Galilee. So it's interesting that you have this conjunction of this passage in Numbers with the Magi on this one piece of Matthew. There's also a passage at the end of Matthew where Jesus goes out with his followers and talks about his coming and how they will know his coming. And he also invokes the phrase from the east, and he says in Matthew 24, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. So again, there's this invocation of the primacy of the direction east throughout Matthew, at least at the beginning and the end. So I find that this interesting bookends of the birth of Jesus associated with the primacy of the east, and then his prediction of his coming also associated with this eastward orientation. So then there's this issue of the star sort of stopping over the birthplace of Jesus. And so, again, my interpretation is that there's sort of this political prediction, and then you have this reverse engineered, I'm sorry if I'm using fancy words, but the idea that you're able to sort of then locate the position because you know the time and you have this alignment that has to be exactly correct with respect to the house system. And then the fact that the star is overhead in the mid-heaven position, which means it's astride both religion and kingdom, which also has a great import in the sense that it would mean that this is really sort of conferring this idea that this person is indeed a religious king, if you like, in a sense. So the way I look at it is that in this book of Matthew, somebody who would understand astrology at some level would sort of put all this together and say that this is basically the heavens conferring this basically saying, yes, this is the Son of God, if you like, by putting this all together in this way. And this would be apparent. Now, Semitic Jewish traditions don't talk much about astrology. There's some passing references, some in favor, some against astrology. And certainly the development of Christian religion shunned astrology, although popes would still have private astrologers and they wouldn't tell anybody about it. But there was this curious kind of disjunction. The Latin writer Tertullian, who wrote many tracts in the 2nd century AD, said that astrology worked up until the birth of Jesus, which I found interesting. But Tertullian also said, which was kind of interesting, this tradition of the eastward orientation persisted in his writing, and in one of his writings he said, when in Latin, translating it, when we stand to pray, we turn to the east. And so this is obviously in Tertullian's mind as sort of bringing this primacy of the east along with Christianity. Now, I did some studies with my students about the eastward orientation of churches, and this persists in Northern Europe and also persisted in people that came to colonize North America. So in fact, this very church which I don't know if it was on a greenfield site when it was built, but it is actually oriented to the east, more or less, a little bit to the south of the east. On the other side of the Alpine barrier, however, the churches don't have that much of an orientation. So if you look in Italy and in Spain, they're all kind of higgledy-piggledy. But if you go to Northern Europe, they're all oriented towards the east. So in some sense, the transferal of Christianity into the Mediterranean area didn't retain this eastward orientation. But what I'm guessing, and nobody really knows, is that the eastward orientation was really a transferal of this primacy of the east in the Northern European tradition that also had the goddess of Easter appearing. And so this is sort of this tradition re-emerging. So this sort of Semitic tradition, but also Northern European tradition. And it sort of re-emerged as Christianity found its way northward. So I found that interesting. Now, this may seem, maybe it's not dull, maybe it is interesting, but let me tell you a personal story where kind of the relationship of the person to the environment came very clear to me, and this is what led me to write this book. So, Karen's heard this story many times, and so she lived it. So you just have to bear with me again. Okay. So we were renting a house in an island called Little Cranberry off Mount Desert Island in Maine. And the year before, we rented the same house, and I rented a kayak from the woman who runs the post office, and I went out and paddled around. I was a little bit familiar with the area. The next year, this was 2003, I rented a kayak, a recreational kayak from her, and she was out of compasses and out of maps. And I said, well, that's okay, I've paddled around. So I was paddling, and I guess I'll draw a little map of what it looks like here. So Little Cranberry Island looks something like this, kind of a crescent shape. And there's another island here called Baker, and some shallows there. And this is north, just so you know that I draw north of the top of the map. And this is the ocean, the open ocean. And I was crossing from this point of land here, and this is about 2 miles across. And just about the time I got there, halfway across, a very thick fog started to roll in. And I realized I didn't have a compass with me, and the possibility of getting lost was very real. So I got very anxious, and I've since read that people, when they get into states of, I guess, strong emotion or survival situations, one of two things happen. One thing that happens is that your senses get heightened, and you have this increased awareness of what's going on around you, and time seems to stand still. Other people sort of shut down, and they cling to preconceived notions, as if that by just punching away at one idea, they're going to get what they need. And usually the latter group are the ones that are in danger. And the other group that kind of opens up and accepts whatever is going on around them tends to survive. And I can give you a reference for that if you like, because there's been a really remarkable book written. In any case, when I was at that point, and I realized I was toast if I didn't think quickly, I noticed the direction of the wind, which was out of the southeast. There was a swell running out of the ocean out of the southwest, and the waves crashing on the beach here made a very loud noise. The rocks were like these rounded boulders about the size of a football, and then when the waves rush up on them, and as the water recedes, they make this very distinct grinding noise associated with it. So I had, this is kind of an auditory directional sense. I had the waves as kind of a perceptual sense, and the wind on my face as a third. So I maintained my direction using those, and then pretty soon I came to these shallows, and I could see, I mean, it was basically a blackout fog. I could see the waves crashing on either side of these shallows, and so even though I couldn't see any land, I knew I'd arrived at the right place because I knew the waves behaved on these shallows. I paddled out past the breakers, and then I paddled around here. There was an incoming tide, so the lobster buoys had these little wakes downstream, and that also helped guide me home. So there were all these little natural signs that I found that got me going home. So that was good. Yeah. So then, fast forward to Columbus Day weekend, that same year, 2003, and So I have a house in Harwichport, which is here. This is Cape Cod. I'm not drawing this terribly well, but you know, you kind of get the idea, right? So you recognize Cape Cod, I hope, right? More or less. Here's Nantucket. Here's Martha's Vineyard. So on. So I launched out on Columbus Day weekend in a recreational kayak without a compass, without a map. Didn't learn a lesson, but I did pay attention to the wind direction as I launched. And also a wetsuit on, which was smart. And so I started paddling this way, and wouldn't you know it, but a really thick fog rolled in. The wind was running out of the southeast, and at times I got completely blanked out. And so what I did was I used the wind as a natural reference and turned north, and then just found the shoreline. And I don't know what the word is, what do you call it when you put your handrail. I handrailed my way along the shoreline, and anytime I got blanked out, I would just turn north. And when I got home, no problem, took the kayak out, took a shower, went out to the movies with my kids, and had dinner. Okay, so that was all good. The next morning I went out paddling, and as it turns out, I got stopped by the harbor master, which was kind of strange, because he pulled me over like he was pulling over somebody speeding. His boat. Then he asked me if I'd seen two girls kayaking, and I said no, and I said, when did they go out? And they went out 3 p.m. the day before, and they were missing, so there was a big search and rescue mission. Now, we think that Karen actually saw them leaving, because as I went out paddling, she went walking down the beach with her friend Beth, some of you know Beth Loudon, right? And they saw two girls launching in kayaks, and Karen knows the weather well enough at the Cape to realize there was a significant chance that fog would roll in at that point, so she made a remark to Beth at that moment. Little did she know. So these girls went out basically a quarter mile down from where I launched at the same time. They told their boyfriends they were only going out for 10 minutes, and after 45 minutes, when they didn't return, the boyfriends alerted the authorities, and there was a massive search and rescue that was launched that evening. The next day, that day where the harbor master caught up with me, they found the two kayaks tied together around here, but no girls in them. And then the next day, they found the body of one of the girls, but never found the body of the other girl. And I guess we went back in November, and I remember walking down the beach past the spot where they launched, and the mother of the girl who was never found had a little placard which read, "Nobody is lost to God." And that's what really hit me. So the thing is, when you read about this sort of thing in the newspaper, you think it's sad, but you know, there's so many sad things in the newspaper, you can't really absorb it. But when you're doing the exact same thing, the exact same time, the exact same place that somebody's doing it, and you had a good time, and you found out that somebody doing the same thing, a group of people doing the same thing died, it really hit me hard. So I became rather obsessive about it because, you know, I couldn't really explain to myself why me and not them. The only difference was the wind direction and paying attention to the wind direction. So I became somewhat obsessive over the course of the year and developed a whole set of navigation strategies based on natural signs, like the positions of stars in the sky. So I had these little flashcards, and I would memorize the positions of stars in the sky, and you know, could tell directions just by a cloudy night, and there's a little break in the clouds, and there's one star, I could tell you which way is north. Got to that point. Predict the weather and read the waves and all this sort of stuff. And then what I found was that this wasn't unique, that other cultures were doing this. Polynesians were using the waves and the stars to navigate. The Norse did this, Arab traders did this. And after about a year, there was this real epiphany, because after developing this whole system that I had, I was observing the stars and the sun and the wind and all these things in a way that made me feel completely connected with the earth, that I was no longer this kind of separate individual that was sort of rationally dissecting things around me, but I was really kind of, you know, I was not separate from the universe, I was part of the universe. And so there was this passage in the book of Job where God appears to Job and basically says, you know, who made the wisdom of the inward parts and this sort of thing. And so this really resonated with me because, you know, it was really sort of saying that, no, you aren't a separate privileged individual in the universe, but you are sort of part of it as a whole. And it's a feeling, it's almost like a spiritual awakening that came upon me. And the flip side of it was that I started to look at people around me, and this was about the time when cell phones, smartphones were coming out. And so people were smartphone walk and that sort of stuff. And I had this sense that they were in grave mortal danger because they weren't noticing their surroundings like I was noticing their surroundings. So I had to suppress this desire to run up to, you know, somebody and say, stop, stop. You don't put that thing down. So that was it was very palpable. So when I returned then to passages like this passage in Matthew, or this passage in the book of Job, all of a sudden it has this evocation of this link to the universe that I really didn't have before, and it's all due to this process of kind of going through this long dark tunnel in the wake of the deaths of these girls. And I remember moments that were, at least for me, rather poignant, where we went one Thanksgiving. My son was at UC London on a semester abroad, and the whole family went over there on Thanksgiving, and Karen asked me to do a little trek, so I did a trek with the alignment of places, Saxon and Gothic and Avebury and Stonehenge. And I just remember when Avebury is this magnificent stone circle, which is huge. I mean, the stones are gigantic and the scale is immense compared to Stonehenge. And this was late November, and I just remember walking around with my family and seeing these long shadows cast on the ground and just this great feeling of kind of belonging in the universe, and that these people before me had also had this great sense of belonging, and this is why they were erecting these structures. And then we went to a Saxon church that was built around 800, and I wanted to investigate its eastward orientation, and then we went to Stonehenge, and then we went to Salisbury Cathedral. Now, Salisbury Cathedral was actually a remarkable discovery for me because I've been checking out the eastward orientation of things. Salisbury Cathedral, which is about 13 miles from Stonehenge, is oriented so east, you can calibrate a compass by it. I mean, I went to Google Earth, and I could not get any more precise than due east than the precision of Google Earth. I mean, that is how precisely east the nave is oriented in Salisbury. So the builders of Salisbury went to great lengths to, get milk that last drop. We're talking about a 13th century Gothic church. So it was rather remarkable. So when we talk about astrology, even if you don't believe in astrology, and you look at these alignments that are done in stone circles, it's really an evocation of this feeling that people had of their sense of belonging in the universe, where all of these celestial events tie them together. And so I see it as having a greater meaning than just this simple predictive issue associated with the stars and the Magi. So that's my story. So, questions? Yeah.
I recall watching a NOVA about the discovery of longitude, and it was associated with British sea travel. Is it related, the longitude going back BC that you mentioned, is it the same concept?
Yeah, longitude was, well, I can tell a little bit of latitude and longitude. Around the time of Pythagoras, the idea of spherical Earth was understood, and probably the Babylonians understood that as well. There was a Greek from what's now Marseille, Pythias, who made these travels as far north, at least, as what's now Great Britain, possibly further north to Norway. And he made the observation that there were these stripes called climes, and this is where all of the characteristics would be the same along basically a swath of latitude. And so the length of day at the summer solstice would sort of be the characteristic of that climb. And so the color of people's skin, their hair, their eye color, the trees, all these things would be the same along this strip of line. So that's what developed into the concept of latitude, and also why the Greeks had more primacy to the north as opposed to the east. Then longitude was just the other angle, because they were fond of developing things in terms of angles. Then the only issue becomes what's the prime meridian. Now you can use celestial observations to establish latitudes. If you establish a prime meridian or zero for longitude by dead reckoning, just by walking or figuring out how long it takes to get from X to Y, you can establish a longitude at different locations on the Earth. And so a lot of tables of latitudes and longitudes in the Middle Ages were based on dead reckoning of momentum travels. So there are already techniques to do that, and you can use the moon to establish longitude. Columbus tried to establish a longitude of Jamaica when he was stranded there using a lunar eclipse and the timing between the sunset and the lunar eclipse. So longitude was used, just not with enough precision. The longitude prize was established because the precision was so poor that there were all sorts of shipwrecks that were occurring. And so the idea is, can you get a precise value for longitude? And that's what developed the naval chronometer. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yep.
Yep.
I may have missed it, it may be so basic that I shouldn't have missed it. The primacy of 12s,
Yeah.
how did that get established, or did it just?
Part of it, well, you have to go back to the Egyptians and the way they observed the sky. This is actually where the 24-hour day came from. And what they did was they would divide the night into 12 equal swaths that were basically associated with stars in the sky. And so depending on what was in the midheaven, that would be one of the particular hours. And so the 12s came originally from the Egyptians and dividing up the sky into 12 pieces.
But was there any basis for the 12s?
12 is divisible by a lot of numbers. I mean, it's also why 360 is a good, 360 is very close to the number of days of the year, and it's divisible. Also, the Babylonians placed a primacy on the number 60, and so 12 is a factor of 60 as well. So, so you have the 24 full division of the day that the Egyptians had. The fact that 360 has so many divisors associated with it that allows you to divide up the year almost, and that 12 factors into 60, which the Babylonians used as their base system, and also 360 as well. So it was the factorization to some extent that drove it.
It would seem to be logical that it would have been 10s.
Well, but 10,
Does
how many
we-
divisors are 10?
Yeah.
10 that is 5, 5 and 2, and that's it.
That's
So you give 2 and 6 and 4 and 3, and and then 12 factors into 60, and so it just when you start to make constructions, like if you start to construct a compass on your own, or do some sort of a geometric construction, you could imagine, I don't know, 8 might make sense, but 12 has a lot of divisors associated with it, and so it sort of neatly fits astronomically. 2 questions.
The image of the star that the Magi followed in modern culture is pictured in a very specific way. I've read theories that the star was actually maybe a supernova or something unusual.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
illuminate us?
Yeah, there are a lot of ideas that people have posited, none of which really hold up, which is why I use the Saxon analogy as sort of the conferral that is kind of a figurative meaning in a sense. One idea was that it was a nova, a bright star, but there's no nova that can be found that really corresponds. And then the question is, when was Jesus actually born? And a lot of people put that at about